Speak to independent analyst now, Khaya Sithole, joining us on the line. Khaya, good to have you. Thank you very much for your time.
Good evening. Good evening to the viewers.
Let's start firstly by this expansion, right, which we are told President Cyril Ramaphosa could have diplomatically negotiated according to Putin to the success that it is right now. Does it represent a game change in as far as the reduction of the hegemony of the West as far as the global affairs are concerned?
So I do think that historically there's always been some serious concerns about how Western countries in particular have really not only shaped how multilateral institutions that everybody sort of needs to have access to, how those institutions should work and how they should be led. And what that has done is that it's created anxieties around what the intentions of those institutions may be, and also how those institutions may then be manipulated to really pursue the outcomes of what other countries want rather than what the globe at large needs. And I think if you look at how institutions like the IMF in particular and the World Bank have dealt with some of the developing countries, it has left a bitter taste in the way in which their rules are written, and some of those rules have left countries that need those resources and those need those institutions worse off than they were before. And I think what we've seen in recent years is the clarion call for these institutions to either reform organically, which has definitely not happened at the right pace, or for alternative ways in which countries can engage to start emerging. So if you now look at what the Brics formation has really done over the past 10 to 15 years, it has really said that, look, actually there is something seriously flawed in the way in which the big, important multilateral institutions engage with the rest of the world. This is what the voice of other institutions, of other countries, which also have significant importance in the globe out there. This is what they think should be done differently, and this is how they think things need to be done differently. South Africa in particular has been calling for reforms to the UN Security Council, for example, and those calls have essentially been ignored for a very long period of time. And I think getting this particular voice to really start growing will then force those institutions to start taking these alternative voices seriously, and perhaps will usher in the much needed reforms in some of the more critical multilateral institutions across the world.
Let's look at the 6 countries themselves that are coming in, that have applied to be a part of this. Maybe let's particularly zoom in on Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. What have they done lately, those particular countries? One, but two, what is their relationships to some of the big guns that are punching quite heavy in this bloc, like China, of course. India has been catching up, and you've got Russia as well.
So I think when you look at the countries that have acceded into the Brics network today, everybody's got complicated histories with themselves, with each other, and with some of the big Western nations. What we do know is that, unfortunately, the fact that our history may have been fractured or may have been shaped differently is not a sufficient condition for people not to negotiate and reform in the way in which things are done. So I think, obviously, if you're asking the United States, for example, what their views are on these particular countries, they'll have particularly strong views. But what South Africa has been saying for a very long time is that the way sovereign states manage their own affairs and the way in which they manage their relationships with other nations is a matter of autonomy for those particular states. So what you want to be able to say is that, look, whilst we may come in on the negotiating table, we understand that every single country has got particular domestic issues that it needs to champion, while still also championing a common vision for humanity and for shared prosperity. And I think that is really the tone that President Cyril Ramaphosa has really been trying to drive forward over the past couple of months, as obviously serious questions have been raised about the question of how tenable South Africa's relationship with Russia, for example, can be, while it still also actively trades and extensively trades with countries like the United States. And I think driving the message of that all sovereign nations have an element of autonomy is quite important. But I think also now when we look at these particular countries, firstly, one of the biggest issues that emerges from here is that the collective voice of these particular nations, the Brics 5 in particular, plus these additional nations, is not a voice that one can afford to ignore. And I think if you look at the population dynamics and you look at the growth potential, which is actually what was the founding thesis of the entire Brics conversation, it is a matter that requires serious attention by all stakeholders across the globe. And of course, for a lot of people, they're simply saying that this is an alliance that's simply trying to pull a middle finger to the West. But I see it as an alliance that is born out of a collective sense of anxiety and frustration about how unresponsive some of these important multilateral institutions have been to the calls for reform and the way to engage differently and the way of engaging better with the rest of the globe. So I think it's an important development in that regard. But it doesn't mean that suddenly South Africa is going to be adopting Saudi Arabia's human rights policies or anything like that. Autonomy remains sacrosanct, but a common vision for humanity is an important development.
I think that's important. But however, we can't avoid the fact, for example, to say we'll come to Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. For example, Iran and its crosshairs with the United States, right? So we've seen how Russia's crosshairs with the United States has become an issue for South Africa, even though they're not really involved in that. So would, for example, that situation of Iran and the United States end up catching up with South Africa or other members of the bloc because of their toasty relationship with the West?
Well, I think the problem here is essentially how the United States tends to be quite paternalistic in these relationships. So, of course, if we're ever going to end up in the process, it will be simply because the United States, for example, takes a view that, well, actually, we don't think you should be friends with them or be friends with us, which is a problematic view there for any country to take. And I think when it comes to the United States in particular, the most serious criticism has been on how it seeks to try and make sure that its own foreign policy agenda becomes a universal policy agenda, which of course is not practical. And I think countries that have strong relationships with the United States, strong trade relationships with the United States, like South Africa, always find themselves having to explain their position and have to explain their stance, which I don't regard as a fair way in which things are to be done. But that being said, what countries like South Africa need to be very clear on is what their stance is and what their foreign policy position is, so that they do not leave room for misinterpretation about essentially what it is that they're trying to do. And I think the episode of South Africa and Russia and the United States in particular was probably reflective of a very poor articulation of South Africa's position in relation to that, which is probably something that we actually hadn't heard with a sense of clarity until President Ramaphosa addressed it a few days ago. So I think once everybody has a very clear understanding of what the policy is, it is difficult for them to actually label accusations against that country or to place accusations against that country of either being complicit in the crimes of Russia, for example, which is what the accusation was earlier on. And to illustrate that is that, for a lot of people, they'd say China and the United States are mortal enemies until you actually dig deeper and you look at the trade that occurs between those countries. And that's simply on the basis that, well, for as long as you understand what your position is, we will be able to engage on the basis that there's no confusion about where you stand on particular issues. So I think a country like South Africa will benefit from a much clear policy stance that says that, look, as far as we're concerned, we have absolutely nothing against this particular country. We also have nothing against you. You may have issues with each other, but as far as we're concerned, the primary basis for our engagement is either on the trade ties, or on the political ties, or the diplomatic ties, and that's what we're going to focus on. We're not going to try and solve the world's problems or internal conflicts across multiple partners. We just don't have the capacity for that.
Yeah. So with us, independent analyst Khaya Sithole, looking at the 6 countries that are now joining the Brics bloc, that alliance, making it 11 now strong countries with a GDP that is said to be higher than that of the G7 group of countries. However, you've got countries, Khaya, there like Argentina, Egypt and Ethiopia coming in. Ethiopia, we know the wars there and what's happening to that economy. Egypt has not been doing that extremely well, versus countries like Saudi Arabia, very liquid, huge SDIs coming into that country, oil-rich countries like the United Arab Emirates. Why do you need to have all of them? What's the benefit?
Well, I think the most important thing about understanding how these alliances are formed is that it isn't really an alliance that is formed out of a singular prism. So, of course, if one simply says, well, perhaps it should be countries that have similar, economic fundamentals, then you're not really trying to build a political alliance. You're probably trying to build an economic alliance there. And I think the danger of that particular analysis is that some countries may legitimately come back and say, well, actually, if we're going to look at the economic might or the economic performance, then a country like South Africa shouldn't have been there in the first place. But if you go back to the deliberations of around 2009 and 2010 and how South Africa formed part of this alliance, it was with this understanding that not only do you look at the potential economic fundamentals, but also there are broader considerations out there. So South Africa, for a long time known as a gateway to the African continent, was quite important for the members of the original BRICS alliance to be able to have that as a partner, whether you then want to pursue primarily the economic, pathways, or you want to pursue the diplomatic pathways. You wanted to have a partner that is strategically important. So similarly, countries like Argentina, for example, whilst they may be performing poorly when it comes to the economic fundamentals, they remain a very important player in the Latin American arena. And what you want to be able to do is to firstly then say, well, can these alliances actually even be leveraged to assist those countries deal with those particular economic issues that they might be facing now? And I think if that is going to be one of the upsides of this, then you actually want to be able to say that no one gets unilaterally excluded on the basis that their currency is not performing well in any particular year. I think that would be a very myopic way of looking at it. So these alliances must have a much broader perspective. They should be able to consider multiple, elements in order to be able to say we actually want to be part of this relationship or not. 20 or 30 or even 40 years ago, somebody may have said, well, China actually doesn't deserve to be part of any alliance if you looked at what their economic indicators were at that point in time. But China has then managed to turn that particular picture around, and who is to say that other countries will not be able to do so in the decades to come.
So I know you're one person who likes to look at agreements and scrutinize them and really see the value of what is being exchanged in these agreements. Now we saw probably the biggest number of MOUs being signed over the last 3 days. The last state visit of China to South Africa, I think only 8 were signed. This time around, 11 of them were signed. Are the conditions attached to these arrangements, including the one where we're going to be assisted with equipment and some money to deal with the energy crisis, are the conditions as loosely put together as what the Minister of Electricity would like us to believe? Or is there something to it in terms of a quid pro quo? What do they say?
Well, the simple thing is that when people sign agreements on behalf of their countries in particular, they cannot afford to be reckless. And I think it will be important for us to acknowledge the fact that whoever's representing South Africa or whoever's representing China in that particular negotiation table would have been given what the non-negotiables are, what the fundamental expectations are in order for us to be able to say this is an agreement we need to sign. So perhaps the agreements that we hear about are a small fraction of what was originally canvassed. And of course, if there are particular aspects of an agreement that really leave a country worse off or leave the country fragile to, changes in the terms of those contracts, then those are ones that you probably should avoid. So I think what we then end up seeing are agreements where perhaps there's been the greatest meeting of the minds, or there's been many more consensus rather than divergence points. And those are the type of agreements that you need to put together. And of course, we should be able to then scrutinize them and then understand what it is that we considered to doing and what it is that we then said these are expectations that we need to actually get out of these agreements, so we can assess whether they are indeed to the best interest of the country. But that's only something that can be done with greater levels of scrutiny, which we haven't been able to do now because they're still fresh.
Yeah. One would say, well, South Africa is not particularly known for reading the fine print very well when they pen these things. I mean, just before the summit, there was talks of whether or not they still want to be a part of that ICC, which they gladly signed at the time. But now when they needed to act on the president of Russia, they were now all of a sudden pedaling backwards, saying, well, do we really need to be a part of this particular regime going forward? And one would think, are we not going to find ourselves in that situation, or similar to the one that we are currently dealing with now, where the PAIA Act has got to be applied as to what agreements were entered to when it comes to the vaccines?
Yeah, and that's a problem of transparency that South Africa has struggled with, because I think when you look at, those agreements relating to vaccines, for example, it was very clear that public resources were going to be used, and on the back of that, it was regarded as legitimate that the public should have some element of insights into what these agreements are all about. And I think what the South African government needs to try and find a way, and do better, is to try and find a way of making sure that society has an understanding of what the key details, what the key granular details are of these agreements, so that you do not end up with this legitimacy crisis where people say, we'll discover in 10 or 15 years' time that they've sold the family jewels. That is not to the benefit of any government, because you do need to have an element of legitimacy with your own voters, with your own citizens. And I think once we then start seeing how some of these agreements get rolled out, then perhaps access to the information will be much easier to foster, because we should be able to ask, well, on what basis is this being done? And if it's on the back of this agreement, what are the terms and what are the conditions conditions. And I think what we've seen historically is that the South African government ends up having to be forced to make this disclosure. So if you look at the whole question around car partnerships, for example, it's really a matter of everybody speculating and trying to figure out what exactly the deal is going to incorporate or not incorporate. And of course, until the government actually plays open cards, a lot of people are going to be unfortunately very skeptical, and that skepticism breeds into an element of contempt against a government, which is not ideal because these deals have indeed been signed, and we're better off knowing about them rather than chasing shadows and hoping that they work for us in the long run.
Yeah. Were you surprised that there was no agreement on the BRICS currency, but they are opting, I suppose, for a rather complicated way of trading, which I'm not quite sure how it's going to work, where each country in the BRICS bloc will trade with their own currencies?
No, I wasn't surprised at all. And the biggest problem here is that over the past few months, I've been trying to highlight that the first issue is that we still do not know what it actually is that we're looking for. Are we simply looking for a new reserve currency, which is to replace the dollar, which is a different conversation to the pursuit of a common currency? And a common currency is best suited for countries that have a greater sense of proximity, because if you look at the euro, for example, it works well because of the proximity dimensions there. A common currency across countries that are spread across so many continents as this one is always going to have particular complexities. But what we do know is that the commitment that was made today was that the central bank governors and the finance ministers are going to go and deliberate over the next year on what really is the most practical and the most important thing to do. And I think for me, it's fairly obvious that the very first goal is to make sure that the trade between the partners themselves is as seamless as possible, which is why that part of the summit resolution that talks about looking at the payment system between the countries and then figuring out whether there's avenues for doing that better, that's far more important than a much more secondary and a much more complicated conversation of coming up with a common currency. If you tend to look at not only the countries that currently make up BRICS, but also the countries that will now make up the expanded BRICS, the very idea of trying to find common ground around a common currency is probably going to take at least a decade to get it right, given the complexities in how China, for example, uses its currency in order to be able to manage its economy in the way that it believes needs to be done better. If you compare to South Africa, for example, which is fully and unequivocally free market based and absolutely does not entertain any interference with the currency. So you've got a lot of divergence points, and until we answer the first question of whether we're trying to develop a new common currency or simply trying to develop a new reserve currency, this was never going to be the type of resolution that was going to emerge today.
All these countries, of course, have got their own individual priorities as to why they are within the BRICS bloc. So far, we know because of its economic power, China has been the champion, I suppose, or the lead to an extent in terms of the bloc. Is this new BRICS Plus going to have that kind of setup continuing where China continues to be the dominant kind of partner?
So I think obviously China, given its economic fundamentals and, its demographic fundamentals, is always going to be very influential within this alliance and even in an expanded alliance. So wherever you plug China, where you're even saying that, G20 must grow, China will always be influential given the role that it plays in the international arena. So I think with this expanded alliance, what you really are going to get is perhaps a greater diversity of voices, a greater diversity of viewpoints. And of course, nothing binds these countries to sign up for things that they completely are uncomfortable with. So if there are particular points where absolutely everybody cannot find common ground, well, you simply do not sign up for them. You do not convert them into summit declarations or summit resolutions. But what you're going to see here is that the collective voice of this much bigger alliance is obviously going to command a much greater sense of clout in geopolitical conversations across the globe. And of course, you might then see even alliances that already exist, whether it's the G7 or the G20, taking a different approach into how it engages with these particular countries, because clearly they have said we can find a way of coordinating and collaborating with each other. And then the next steps is to obviously then iron out some of the more fundamental differences and then pursue a common agenda that then says, actually, this is the upside for this alliance, for the citizens of all affected nations and for the economies of all affected nations.
Yeah. Khaya, we've now had, of course, the geopolitical view. One might say, well, we have a narrow view as South Africans. Most of the time we like to localize things. We've had the geopolitical view. We've had the global view. But let's narrow it into South Africa a little bit. The host, President Cyril Ramaphosa, how does this play out for him? I mean, he's heading to the polls in 2024. him playing on an international stage, seemingly playing it very well with the leaders on that level. How does it translate for him as far as his fate come 2024?
I think the question of the 2024 elections is really a question of the local and fundamental factors that a lot of South African citizens have been using as a basis for deciding who to vote for, or even whether to vote at all. I think the cementing of international alliances, which is what we've seen over the past week, is something that is definitely a positive for President Ramaphosa, because it's seen as a person who got these deals across the line, and even President Putin paid him some strong compliments today. But I think on that own, it didn't really sway a lot of the voters who've already taken a view on the capacity of the government to deal with local and domestic issues. And I think over the next few months, those are still going to be central to the question of what the ANC's electoral prospects are going to be when you head to 2024. And I think what we do know as a country is that even when we do form part of these global alliances, we've often struggled to then cascade that to the grassroots benefit out here. So if you remember, when President Ramaphosa came in particular, he had these investment conferences which were well supported and well embraced by the international investor community. But because of the limitations that exist and the bottlenecks that exist in the energy and the logistics value chain in South Africa, a lot of those very strong commitments have really not translated onto tangible actions on the ground. So until you deal with those particular issues on the ground, it actually doesn't matter how many trillions that you've raised, because South African citizens will say, well, what has been the benefit of this? Because we're not seeing new infrastructure on the ground, for example. So unfortunately, as good as this past week has been, you need to be able to do a lot of work on the ground, on the domestic front, in order to actually harness or leverage the benefit of what we've seen over the past week. So if there are new deals that have been put together, those new deals depend on the ability of the South African system to actually ensure that those deals translate into tangible action plans. And that is our great struggle.
Khaya Sithole, much appreciated as always. Thanks so much for coming on and your intervention here tonight. That's Khaya Sithole, the independent analyst, following 6 countries being added as of the 1st of January 2024 to the Brics bloc of nations, and their contribution to that alliance, and how, of course, that fares for the African continent.